They said a glass of water had to be earned, but no one in that room was ready to pay the price of denying it. And Naomi Brooks felt it in her chest the moment the manager's voice cut through the polished silence of the restaurant, sharp and dismissive. "We don't serve people like you," he said, not even looking at her, not even seeing her, while just outside the glass doors a small boy clutched his throat, coughing in dry, desperate breaths under the late summer heat that clung to the pavement like a second skin. And Naomi stood there in her plain uniform, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, something older, because this wasn't the first time she had asked for help and been told no. The marble floors beneath her feet reflected chandeliers worth more than her yearly pay, the air inside cool and scented with expensive wine and polished wood. A world built on comfort that somehow had no space for a single glass of water. She tried again, softer this time. Respectful, careful. "It's not for me. It's for him," she said, nodding toward the boy outside. But the manager let out a quiet laugh, the kind that made nearby tables turn just enough to watch without being obvious. "Then maybe he should learn where he belongs," he replied, lifting a glass from a passing tray, cold condensation slipping down its side. And for a brief second Naomi hoped, he might hand it over. But instead he tilted it slightly, letting the water spill slowly onto the floor, clear drops vanishing into the shine of marble as if it had never existed at all. A few guests chuckled, others looked away, pretending not to notice, and Naomi's throat tightened, not from thirst but from the weight of standing invisible in a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth. She could hear the boy again, weaker now, and her chest ached with a memory she never spoke about. A memory that lived just beneath the surface of every quiet moment, and still she didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, because survival had taught her when silence was safer than pride. But what no one noticed, what no one cared to notice, was the man seated in the far corner, untouched. Meal in front of him, fingers resting lightly against the table, eyes steady, watching everything unfold without a single word. Victor Castellano had not come for dinner, and as the room settled back into its illusion of normal, as if nothing had happened, as if no line had been crossed, something unseen had already begun to shift, slow and certain, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. Naomi did not move right away, even as the last drop of water disappeared into the marble beneath her shoes, because something inside her refused to accept how easily compassion had just been denied. Her eyes drifting back to the boy outside, whose small frame leaned against the glass, his breath uneven, his fingers leaving faint streaks as he tried to steady himself against the door. And for a moment the entire world narrowed to that image alone, not the laughter behind her, not the quiet clinking of silverware, not even the weight of being watched, just the memory rising uninvited, sharp and relentless, of a hospital hallway years ago where she had stood just as helpless, just as unseen, waiting for someone to care enough to act. And that memory pressed against her ribs now, urging her forward when everything else told her to step back, to stay quiet, to survive. But Naomi Brooks had learned that silence had a cost too, and sometimes it was heavier than any consequence she feared. So she turned slightly, ignoring the manager's dismissive glance, and reached for a clean glass from a nearby tray, her movements careful, almost invisible, as if she could borrow a moment of kindness without permission. But before her fingers could close around it, his hand came down sharply over the tray, stopping her, not violent, just firm enough to remind her of her place. "I said no," he repeated, lower this time, more controlled, the kind of tone meant to humiliate without raising suspicion. And Naomi felt the eyes again, the subtle shift of attention, the way people leaned just enough to witness without involvement, and her hand slowly withdrew, hovering in the space between action and restraint. And for a second it seemed like that was where the moment would end, another quiet defeat, swallowed by the room, another invisible line drawn and accepted. But across the restaurant, in that shadowed corner where the light did not quite reach, Victor Castellano leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, his fingers tapping once against the table, not impatient, not uncertain, but deliberate, measuring something no one else could see. Because what unfolded before him was not just about a glass of water, it was about choice. about who people revealed themselves to be when no one forced them otherwise, and he had seen enough. More than enough. The manager turned away already, satisfied with his quiet victory, signaling to staff as if the situation had resolved itself, as if dignity could be dismissed as easily as a request. And Naomi stood there, still, the distance between her and the door suddenly feeling like miles, her breath slow, controlled, her eyes steady on the boy who was now sliding slightly against the glass. And that was when the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made conversations falter mid-sentence, because a chair moved, smooth against the floor, and Victor Castellano rose to his full height, not rushing, not announcing himself, but carrying with him a presence that did not ask for attention and yet commanded it all the same. And though no one spoke, something in the air changed, something quiet and undeniable, like the moment just before truth refuses to stay hidden any longer. Victor Castellano did not raise his voice when he stepped forward, and that was what made people notice, not noise, not force, but the quiet certainty in the way he moved through the room, as if space itself adjusted for him. His shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, yet every step seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Conversations faded, glasses paused mid-air, and even the manager, who had just turned away, felt it before he fully saw it, that subtle shift that made him straighten his posture, adjusting his tie without understanding why. Victor stopped a few feet from Naomi, his gaze not on her at first, but on the faint trail of water that had already vanished from the floor, as if the moment had tried to erase itself. Then his eyes lifted, calm, steady, taking in the manager with a look that held no anger, no raised emotion, only a level of clarity that was far more unsettling. "You denied water," he said, his voice even, measured, not loud but somehow reaching every corner of the room. The manager forced a polite smile, the kind practiced in front of important guests. "Sir, there are policies. We have standards to maintain," he replied, choosing his words carefully now, aware that something about this man was different, though he could not yet place it. Victor tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer, as if weighing it against something unseen. Then he glanced toward the glass doors where the boy now sat on the ground, his small back pressed against the entrance. And for the first time, Victor's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a fraction, enough to reveal that he had noticed everything from the beginning. "Standards," he repeated softly, the word carrying a meaning that no longer sounded respectable. The manager nodded quickly, sensing an opportunity to regain control. "Yes, sir. We must ensure the right atmosphere for our guests." And that was when Victor finally looked directly at Naomi, really looked at her, not as staff, not as background, but as a person standing in the center of a moment no one else had the courage to hold, her posture still, her hands quiet at her sides, her eyes no longer lowered but steady, meeting his without defiance, without fear, just truth. And something in that silent exchange settled the decision that had already been forming. Victor turned back to the manager, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying something that could not be mistaken. "If a glass of water depends on who is asking," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the sentence to settle into the room, "then everything you serve here has already lost its value." No one moved, no one spoke. The manager's smile faltered, just slightly, confusion mixing with unease as he tried to respond, but the words did not come, because in that moment it was no longer about policy or image or control. It was about being seen for exactly what had just happened, without excuse, without distraction. And the room, filled with people who had chosen silence, now found itself unable to look away as the balance quietly shifted in a direction none of them had expected. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first, because the room had already shifted away from him. The confidence he carried just moments ago now replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, and he forced a small laugh as if to recover. "Sir, I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone carefully polished again, but the edge beneath it betrayed him. Victor did not move, did not interrupt. He simply watched, allowing the man to speak into his own unraveling. "We treat all guests with respect here," the manager continued, gesturing lightly toward the dining room as if the evidence surrounded him. But even as he said it, a few eyes dropped, a few shoulders shifted, because everyone in that space had witnessed the opposite. Victor's gaze swept the room slowly, not accusing, not dramatic, just present. And that presence alone seemed to press against every silent choice that had been made. All guests, Victor repeated, almost thoughtfully. Then he took a single step toward the glass doors, not rushing, not asking permission. And for a moment, no one stopped him. Not the manager, not the staff, not even the guests who instinctively parted just enough to let him pass. As if something in them understood this was no longer theirs to control. The late afternoon light spilled in as the door opened, warm and heavy against the cool interior. And Victor stepped outside where the air felt different, less filtered, more honest. The boy looked up weakly, his small chest rising unevenly, and Victor crouched down just enough to meet him at eye level, his movements steady, unhurried. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small sealed bottle of water, something simple, something that should never have been withheld, and placed it gently in the child's hands. "Take small sips," he said quietly, his voice softer now, not for the room behind him, but for the moment in front of him. The boy nodded faintly, gripping the bottle like something far more valuable than it should have been, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow again, not around power, not around status, but around something much simpler, something human. Victor stood and turned back toward the entrance, the door still open, the cool air inside meeting the warmth outside. And when he stepped back in, the silence was deeper than before, heavier, because now there was no ambiguity left, no misunderstanding to hide behind. Only truth standing plainly in the center of the room. The manager straightened again, trying to regain footing, but the balance had already shifted too far. Victor's voice returned, calm as ever, but now carrying a finality that did not need to be raised to be heard. "You chose policy over compassion," he said, each word landing with quiet precision. "And now you will choose what comes next." The manager blinked, confusion flickering across his face, because this was not how these moments usually ended. There was no argument, no escalation, just a calm statement that somehow felt more decisive than any raised voice. And around them, the room remained still, waiting, as if everyone present understood that whatever happened next would not just belong to one man, but to the choice they had all just witnessed. The manager swallowed, his throat suddenly dry in a way he could not explain, because for the first time since he had taken control of this room, he no longer felt in control of anything at all, his eyes flickering toward the staff as if searching for support. But no one stepped forward, no one spoke. They simply stood there, caught between habit and something unfamiliar that had quietly taken its place: accountability. "Sir, I can assure you we followed procedure," he said, though the words lacked the confidence they once carried. Victor studied him for a moment, not with anger, not with impatience, but with a calm attention that made excuses sound smaller the longer they were spoken. "Procedure," Victor repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word. Then he glanced around the room again, at the polished tables, the untouched plates, the people who had chosen comfort over courage just minutes before, and something about his stillness made it impossible to look away. "Tell me," he continued, his voice steady, "when did procedure replace judgment?" The question did not demand an answer, but it lingered, settling into the space between them, and the manager felt it, felt the way it stripped away the safety of rehearsed responses, leaving only the truth he had tried to avoid. His gaze dropped for a brief second before he forced it back up, but that moment had already been seen, already understood. Behind Victor, Naomi remained where she had been, not stepping forward, not claiming anything, her presence quiet yet undeniable, because this had never been about her demanding respect. It had always been about others choosing whether to give it. And now that choice stood exposed in front of everyone. Victor turned slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge her without shifting the weight of the moment away from where it belonged. "You asked for something simple," he said, not loudly, not softly, just clearly. "And you were denied." Naomi held his gaze, her expression steady, no bitterness, no triumph, only the quiet strength of someone who had learned to stand in difficult moments without breaking. And that steadiness seemed to settle something final in Victor's decision. He faced the manager again, his posture unchanged, but the air around him carried a different kind of finality now. "This place prides itself on excellence," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room, as if including everyone within it. "But excellence without humanity is just decoration." The words landed without force, yet they carried further than any raised voice could have. The manager opened his mouth again, perhaps to defend, perhaps to explain, but Victor raised a hand slightly, not to silence him harshly, but to signal that the moment for explanation had already passed. "You had the opportunity to correct it," Victor continued, "and you chose not to." The simplicity of that statement left no room for interpretation, no space to hide behind intention or misunderstanding. And around them, the room remained still, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because something essential had just been revealed, something that could not be unseen. The manager stood there, the weight of the room now pressing in from all sides, and for the first time, he understood that this was not about a single decision. It was about what that decision said about him, about the place he represented, about the people who had watched and said nothing. And in that quiet, undeniable realization, the balance shifted completely, leaving only one question hanging in the air: what would he do now that he had been seen? The question lingered longer than anyone expected, not because it was complicated, but because it was undeniable, and the manager felt it settle into his chest like a weight he could not shift, his eyes drifting again, this time not toward the staff, not toward the guests, but toward Naomi, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as background, not as inconvenience, but as the center of everything that had just unfolded. And in that moment something in his posture changed, subtle but visible, the rigid confidence softening into something closer to uncertainty. "I may have handled it poorly," he said, the words careful, measured, as if testing whether they were enough to restore what had been lost. But the room did not move, did not react, because everyone understood that this was not about phrasing, it was about truth. Victor watched him without interruption, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the difference to become clear. An apology offered to escape. Discomfort was not the same as one offered to acknowledge harm, and the manager seemed to realize it as he spoke again, this time quieter, less guarded. "I should not have refused," he added, his voice no longer performing, but admitting, and for a brief moment, something shifted again, not in power, but in awareness, the kind that only comes when someone stops defending and starts seeing. Victor gave a slight nod, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition that the man had stepped onto a different ground, even if only slightly, then corrected. Victor said simply, the instruction clear, direct, leaving no room for delay. The manager hesitated for half a second, as if the habit of control still lingered. Then he turned, reaching for a fresh glass, his movements no longer sharp or dismissive, but deliberate, almost careful, as if aware that every action now carried weight. He filled it slowly, the sound of water returning to glass echoing more loudly than it should have, and when he stepped toward Naomi, he stopped at a respectful distance, extending the glass with both hands, not as authority, not as transaction, but as something closer to offering. "I am sorry," he said, meeting her eyes fully this time, and the room held its breath again, not out of fear, but out of attention. Naomi looked at the glass for a moment, then back at him, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet steadiness, the kind that did not need validation. She accepted the glass gently, her fingers brushing the cool surface, and without hesitation, she turned and walked toward the door, stepping back into the warmth outside where the boy still sat, now more stable, his breathing slower. She knelt beside him and placed the glass in his hands, guiding it slightly, slowly. She whispered, her voice soft, patient, and the boy nodded, taking small sips, each one easing the strain that had filled the air moments before. Inside, Victor remained where he stood, watching not the manager, not the guests, but the simple act unfolding beyond the glass. And something in his expression settled, not satisfaction, not relief, but a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had been restored to what it should have been from the beginning. When Naomi stood again and stepped back inside, the room felt different, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been chosen. And as she passed Victor, Their eyes met once more, no words exchanged. None needed, because in that silent exchange, something had already been understood, something the entire room had just learned, whether they were ready to admit it or not. The room did not return to normal after that, even though the music resumed and the quiet clinking of glasses slowly crept back into the air, because something invisible had shifted in every person present, a quiet awareness that could not be undone, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed, and the manager, still standing near the center of it all, adjusted his posture again. But this time there was no performance in it, only a man trying to understand how easily control had slipped from his hands, his eyes moving briefly toward Victor, then away, as if unsure how to hold that gaze now that everything had been revealed, while the guests who had once watched with amusement now avoided eye contact altogether, their attention suddenly drawn to their plates, their phones, anywhere but the truth they had just witnessed. And in that silence, Naomi returned to her place quietly, not reclaiming space, not demanding recognition, simply existing with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. Yet the difference was undeniable, because now she was no longer invisible. Now every step she took carried the weight of being seen, of being acknowledged, and that changed everything without a single word needing to be spoken. Victor remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze drifting once more across the room, not searching, not judging, simply observing what had become clear, and then he turned slightly toward the manager, closing the distance between them with the same measured calm as before. "You have a well-designed place," he said, his voice even, almost conversational, yet every syllable held the same quiet authority that had shaped the entire room. The manager nodded quickly, unsure whether this was praise or something else entirely. "Thank you, sir. We take pride in our environment," he replied, but Victor's expression did not change. "Then understand this," Victor continued, his tone steady, not harsh, not raised. "People remember how they are treated far longer than they remember how a place looks." The words settled, deeper than anything that had been said before, because they did not accuse, they defined, and the manager felt it, felt the truth of it pressing against everything he thought he had built, his lips parting slightly, as if to respond, but again finding nothing that could stand against it. Around them, a few guests began to gather their things quietly, not in protest, not in panic, but in a subtle acknowledgement that the atmosphere they had come for no longer existed. It had been replaced by something more real, something less comfortable, and that discomfort moved through the room like a quiet current. Victor glanced toward the exit once more, where the boy now sat upright, calmer, his breathing steady, and Naomi's earlier presence lingered there like a reminder of what should have happened without intervention. Then Victor reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the nearest table, not dramatically, not for display, just enough for the manager to notice. The man picked it up with careful hands, his eyes scanning the name, and in that instant, recognition struck, not loudly, not visibly to everyone, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he breathed, because the man before him was not simply a guest, not simply an observer, but someone whose influence extended far beyond this room, someone who did not need to raise his voice to reshape everything within it. Victor met his gaze one final time, not with intimidation, not with threat, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, and then he turned and walked toward the door, his steps as quiet as when he arrived, leaving behind a room that would not forget what it had just learned, and a question that would linger long after he was gone, not about power, not about status, but about the cost of choosing indifference when compassion had been so easily within reach. Victor Castellano did not look back as he stepped out into the fading light, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than anything that had happened inside. And for a moment the restaurant remained suspended in that silence, as if unsure whether it was allowed to breathe again. The manager still holding the card in his hand, his fingers tightening slightly around its edges as the weight of what it represented settled deeper into his understanding, not just who Victor was, but what his presence had revealed, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the room began to move again, but nothing felt the same. The conversations that resumed were quieter, the laughter more restrained, as if everyone present had become aware of something they could not unsee. Naomi continued her work without announcement, moving between tables with the same calm efficiency she had always carried. Yet now the eyes that followed her were different, not dismissive, not amused, but thoughtful, uncertain, even respectful in a way that had not existed before. And though no one spoke it aloud, the shift was undeniable, because once dignity is witnessed, it cannot be ignored without consequence. The manager eventually set the card down on the counter, but his posture did not return to what it had been. The sharp edges of authority softened into something more cautious, more aware, as if each decision now carried the memory of that moment with it. And across the room, one of the guests who had laughed earlier quietly called a server over, requesting a glass of water, not with entitlement, but with a glance toward Naomi that lingered just long enough to suggest something had changed. Outside, the boy stood now, steadier, holding the empty bottle in his small hands, and Naomi stepped out briefly to check on him once more, her voice gentle, her presence grounding in a way that did not need recognition. "You are okay now," she said softly, and the boy nodded, offering a small smile before walking off with slow but certain steps. And as Naomi watched him go, something in her shoulders eased, a quiet release of tension she had carried long before this moment began. When she turned back toward the restaurant, the glass doors reflected her for a second, not as invisible, not as overlooked, but as someone who had stood in the center of something that mattered. And inside, the atmosphere continued to adjust, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways. A chair pulled out with more care, a tone softened, a glance reconsidered, and though Victor was no longer there, his presence lingered in the choices being made, in the hesitation before dismissal, in the awareness that respect was not something reserved, but something revealed through action. And the manager, standing behind the counter once more, looked toward Naomi as she returned, not as staff, not as interruption, but as a reminder. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, he inclined his head slightly, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement, and Naomi met that gesture with the same quiet steadiness she had always carried, because she did not need the room to change to know her worth. But now that it had, even slightly, something deeper had been restored, not just for her, but for everyone who had been forced to see. And though the evening continued, though the lights remained warm and the service resumed, the truth of what had happened did not fade. It settled, quietly, into the foundation of the place, where it would remain long after the memory of any single night had passed. By the time the evening reached its quiet close, the restaurant looked exactly the same soft lighting, the same polished marble, the same carefully arranged tables, but something invisible had settled into every corner, something that could not be cleaned or reset with closing procedures, because it was not part of the space, it was part of the people who had been inside it. The manager stood alone for a moment after the last guests had left, the card still resting where he had placed it earlier, and he picked it up again, turning it slightly between his fingers as if hoping it might feel different now. But it did not. Its weight remained steady, a reminder rather than a threat, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering in a way they had not all night, because for the first time he was no longer performing for anyone. There was no audience left, only reflection across the room. Naomi finished her final task, folding a cloth with the same care she had given everything. She did, not rushed, not distracted, and when she straightened, she paused briefly, her gaze moving across the space, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding, because she knew something had shifted here, even if it was small, even if it would take time to grow into something lasting. And that was enough. She reached for her bag, simple and worn from years of use, and made her way toward the door, her steps light, unburdened in a way they had not been when she first walked in. And as she passed the counter, the manager looked up, meeting her eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a clear, deliberate acknowledgement. "Good night, Naomi," he said, her name spoken not as an afterthought, but as something recognized, something respected. And Naomi gave a small nod in return, her expression unchanged, but her presence somehow fuller, more grounded, as if the room itself had finally adjusted to who she had always been. Outside, the night air felt cooler, calmer, and she stepped into it with a quiet breath, the city moving around her in its usual rhythm. unaware of the shift that had taken place behind those doors, unaware of how something as simple as a glass of water had revealed so much inside. The manager remained where he was, the card still in his hand, and after a long moment, he placed it carefully into his pocket, not to hide it, but to keep it, because he understood now that it was not just a name. It was a moment he could not afford to forget, and in that stillness, with no one watching, he looked around the empty room and saw it differently, not as a place of control, but as a place where choices would now carry meaning he could no longer ignore, and somewhere beyond the walls. Victor Castellano moved on without pause, without announcement, his role in the moment complete, leaving behind no spectacle, no demand, only a truth that had quietly taken root. And that night, nothing dramatic followed, no headlines, no sudden transformation, just a subtle, steady change in the way people chose to act when given the chance. And that was enough. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with noise, sometimes it arrives in silence, reshaping everything without asking permission. And that day, without anyone fully realizing it, the room had learned what dignity looks like.